I'm introducing this morning's speaker. Dr. Ann Garrido is an associate professor of homiletics at the Aquinas Institute of Theology, where she also received her master's in divinity and doctor of ministry in preaching. In addition to preaching, she has served the school in a variety of administrative capacities, including program director for the doctor of ministry in preaching, director of the master's in pastoral studies, and catechesis of the Good Shepherd, which is a Montessori-based religious formation for children beginning at age 3. Also director of field education, director of distance learning, and director of the Aquinas Ministry Integration Project. Most recently, she oversaw a 3-year grant project that established new best practices for conflict management. Dr. Garrido is author of Redeeming Administration, Mustard Seed Preaching, Preaching to the Choir, and a concise guide to supervising a ministry student, and formerly served as senior editor of Human Development. Let us welcome Dr. Ann Garrido.
Good morning. Many moons ago now, when I was a brand spanking new graduate student at that very fine theological institute that Jenny mentioned, just 3 miles walking distance from here, I had the good fortune of being not only a student of, but a research assistant to the liturgist extraordinaire Catherine Vinci and her colleague, both in scholarship and in comedy, Father Frank Quinn, who I know is a fond memory for many in this group. Frank and Catherine taught me many, many memorable lessons about liturgical presiding, public presence in general, and one etched across my mind for forever was offered as I tried to model the Oran's position while holding a liturgical text. I think the exact words were, "Garrido, what are you doing? You look like a wounded bird up there." Another similarly memory permanently impressed on my brain immediately after I led my very first sung Vespers with incense, when it was announced in the front of the class, "Well, that wasn't bad considering you don't have a very good voice." So, if over the course of the next 45 minutes, I remain strangely rooted to this ambo, with both hands on the podium, and I do not dare engage in a rousing call and response experience a la the brilliant Ray East or Michael Jonkis, you will have some idea as to why. But that's not actually the real reason why I bring up Frank and Catherine as we start this talk. I start with them because they were the ones who actually first launched me into the topic which we're going to talk about today, the topic of conversion. It started as a research project that Catherine was pursuing at the time on the rite of Christian initiation for adults. And she sent me into the bowels of the local Benedictine monastery in order to research an interpretation of the term conversatio morum. She told me we tend to think of conversion as a lightning bolt from the heavens, a sort of life-changing experience that we have in which we are never the same again. Once we were sinners, now we are saints. Once we were lost, now we're found. Sometimes it's experienced that way, she said. But lots of times, conversion is a much more slow and gradual, ordinary kind of experience. Conversion is not an event, but a way of life. And the Benedictines, she suspected, knew something about that. Now, many of you probably already know this, but it was news to me at the time that Benedictines don't take the traditional 3 vows that we have impressed on our memory of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Rather, their vows are obedience, stability, and then here's our mystery term for the morning, conversatio morum. It turns out that even Benedictines have a hard time describing or deciding how to translate this term. Many say conversion of life or ongoing transformation of the heart. Even as they promise never to move for the rest of their lives, they promise to always remain open to growing, always open to changing, to not being the exact same person they were when they entered the order. Even as they commit themselves to the same 4 walls, they promise to always be on a journey. The Benedictines themselves admit there's an irony to this. On one hand, stay put, and on the other hand, move. This past winter, I was working on a project in Manhattan, right in the heart of the city. One of the busiest intersections. There are buses and there are taxis going in every which way. And of course, I turned where you should to get some guidance for how to cross the street, and this is what flashed back at me. Like, really? Which is it? What do you want me to do? Stay or move? My life is at stake. For the Benedictines, though, this kind of double signal is not so much an irony as a paradox. That stay-go dynamic of their vows is intended not as a mixed message to kind of confuse the monks, but more like a Zen koan, intended to get them to pause and to wonder and to live that mystery of stability and change serving one another. The Benedictine insight is that the most meaningful and substantive conversions all take place not in a flash of light, but in slow and glacial shifts that are invisible to the eye. Last week, I was in the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, in a town called Homer that sits right on the edge of the Great Harding ice field. It's really this huge river of frozen water, this huge river of ice that moves at approximately 6 inches per year. Likewise, conversatio morum is the daily life that slowly, one day at a time, hopefully changes that young novice some 60 or 80 years into the future into a holy monk, describes one Benedictine. The difference from one day to the next is not detectable over time. It can be parallel to the slow dripping of water that eventually wears down that solid stone. Now, granted, this is not particularly exciting to watch. Nobody falls off a horse like in Caravaggio's great painting of Paul. There's no one running naked through the streets in Assisi. As one of my good friend's daughters walked up to her while she was cleaning the kitchen, 7 years old, I kid you not, and says to her mom, "So, this is life." I thought it would have more pizzazz. But the remarkable thing is that even though it's invisible to the eye, glacial change is the sort of thing that falls mountains and raises valleys, to borrow some of Isaiah's language. Glacial change transforms not just persons, but the contours of a whole environment through a slow-moving dance of ice and rock. Acquire a peaceful spirit, and around you thousands will be saved, says the great Russian Orthodox mystic Seraphim of Sarov. In other words, change yourself, and thousands around you will be changed. Cultures, like mountains, move just one pebble at a time. There seems to be something very wise to me about this vow of conversatio morum, and something not particular to the Benedictine life, but rather to all of us who are baptized, which was, of course, what Catherine's intuition was from the very beginning. Our baptism is perhaps best conceived not as an event, though of course it is that too, but a commitment to a way of living within the confines of a particular community and tradition, yes, but always on a journey. The work of baptism on us is not yet complete. To use an image from Elizabeth Johnson's work, it was sent to her on the back of a postcard from a friend who said, "I suspect that we're not in the wool or in the ball of yarn, we're in the twirling." The ancient monastics frequently described their embrace of the monastic vocation as a second baptism, a radical recommitment to living the Paschal mystery, marked by that necessary flurry of zeal in which they flung themselves into the wilderness of Cappadocia as if into a baptismal font. But then, like the rest of us, they had to learn how to swim around in there, how to tread water. And I wonder if this idea of embracing one's life work as a second baptism might not be a helpful one for all of us, whether we're monastic or not. At some point in time, each of us flings ourselves into music or marriage or a life of ministry. We dive wholeheartedly into the diaconate or diaper changing or that department of mysteries that resides inside of the diocesan office. And then, after the ecstasy, as one author so fabulously puts it, the dishes. So this is life, we think. I thought it would have more pizzazz. And then, like a monk, we begin to get schooled in that practice of turning and growing and learning and changing in the place where we are. The practice of conversatio morum, coming to terms with the limits of the life that we have chosen. And we come to realize that that joy that we're seeking is not somewhere else. It won't be found by further roaming outward, but rather, when you can't go out, you go down. Like a screw, moving into the depth while at the same time more firmly bonding yourself with each torque to that place where you already are. What are the disciplines of conversatio morum? What kinds of practices, what kinds of dispositions, habits help us to live a life of ongoing transformation right where we are? What kinds of things help us if we want to always be lifelong treaders in the pool of our baptism? A point of intrigue among the Benedictines of this age is the somewhat recent recovery of that precise term, conversatio morum. in their rule. Previously, for a long time, it had been written as conversio morum. For a number of centuries, there had been just this ever so slight error in the copying of Benedict's original words, which you can see would be a really easy one to make. But scholars in the Benedictine life are now fairly unanimous in their understanding that Benedict very intentionally chose the phrase conversatio rather than conversio. Now, I know you're like, why are you going on about this matter? It's a really small difference, but conversatio has a nuance that I just want to point out, slightly different. It hints at one possible translation of the word not just being conversion of life, but conversation of life. Something that my spell check when I was writing this was very, very insistent upon. And you understand why the Benedictines themselves say this is such a hard term to translate. Thomas Merton apparently was so struck by that little tweak that when he was editing a version of his journals, he called them a vow of conversation. I'm taking a vow of conversation. And it makes me to wonder, what's the relationship between conversion and conversation? How is the ability to always remain open to changing and learning related to the capacity to enter into conversation with each other? Here's where I want to spend the remainder of our time this morning, because it strikes me that that choice of terms in Benedict's rule is not accidental. And 17 years after Frank and Catherine sent me out on that quest to unpack the term conversatio morum, I'm still figuring this one out. Now, I hesitate to burden you with a personal story. One never knows when you will bore people silly or whether you will strike a chord in their own experience and we'll be able to sit back together and enjoy that resonance. I'm going to trust that that our ministries in the church, though they are diverse, and that apparently, even though you sing and I apparently should not, that our lives in the service of this church have enough in common that you will recognize the plot lines and the characters of the story I tell, and they will feel familiar, even if yours have different names and they play the organ. So the story I'm about to tell begins after 2002. When it became increasingly clear to me that the church did not always practice what it preached, and in some rather grandly embarrassing ways. But worse than that the very place where I worked and loved, that we as a community were not entirely consonant between what we taught and what we practiced among ourselves. Not the bishops, not Rome, us. And perhaps worst of all, eventually arrived at the awareness that I, yes, me, shocking, did not always behave in ways that were consonant with what I advocate when I teach. The place where the iceberg most frequently appeared above the surface was in our faculty meetings among 4 of the youngest members of our faculty, of which I was one. If there was to be a disagreement at the faculty meeting over a theological stance, choice of opening song for commencement, curricular shift, advising of a student, the way that school mass was going to be celebrated, you can bet that 2 or more of the 4 of us were somehow intimately involved in it. Now, we thought that we kept this pretty well hidden beneath the surface, but apparently it was not so. As one of my own advisees said to me, "We students can tell that there's a lot of tension among you. You guys don't like one another." So, being of the academic sort, we did the kind of thing that all academics do when they encounter an intractable problem that they want to understand better. We applied to an arm of the Lilly Foundation, the church's one foundation, for grant assistance. And over the course of a 2-year period, we joined the goodwill of us church-type people with the expertise of the Harvard Negotiation Project to see if we could make some progress on the way that we handle conflict among ourselves, with an eye toward giving better witness to our students. In particular, the 4 of us who argued the most committed to talking amongst ourselves about our most contentious topic, and then modeling what good, healthy conversation on this topic would look like, and modeling it in front of the entire school body. The topic that we chose to talk about was truth. Truth. Now, I know that sounds all nerdy, like only a thing that people with PhDs in philosophy and theology would even care about, but really, is this not what most of our arguments as a country and as a church are really about? What is it? Who has it? How do we know? What difference does it make? Now think for a moment of an argument that you have engaged in your parish and tell me honestly, does it not ultimately have to do with one of those questions? Nod your head if you know what I am talking about. Putting on this symposium required us to talk with each other and make decisions together over a 6-month period. And one day, during a practice session, we were locked in a room for 13 hours with each other and a professional mediator. We got so into the thick of it that we forgot to take bathroom breaks and discovered by the time we emerged from the room that the pizza, which we had told the delivery man to stick in the oven, had been burnt to a crisp. Looking in on it from the outside, we got nowhere. I disagreed with one member of the group at the end of the day more vehemently than I did when the day began. But as we plodded forward, planning the symposium, readying ourselves to speak publicly with each other, something strange began to occur. A sort of conversion, not the intellectual sort. No one was actually persuaded to hold a different opinion than they came with, but of a soul sort. A smile in the communion line, a nod across the table at a committee meeting, an email that got answered in a more timely manner than usual, a gesture of personal concern. We weren't actually understanding each other's ideas, but we were understanding better how each person ticked to their own metronome. Or at least, by God, we were trying. And at the tail end of the project, I had this little glimmer of light. We were sitting across from each other at table, having a final dinner of and engaged in the same sort of argumentative back and forth conversation that had gotten us into this project in the first place. And then I saw it. You, I pointed to the colleague across the table. You have been disagreeing with me from the day that you got here. There is not one idea I've had that you have not opposed or quibbled about, nothing I have said that you have not dissected and pulled apart. But you're not doing this because you think I'm your intellectual inferior. You're doing this because you think I'm your equal. You think I'm worth debating with. And he kind of like shrugged. It's like, yeah, why else? And suddenly everything looked different. He did not change his opinions, did not shift his opinions one iota. And I assure you, he cared a great deal about iotas. But this behavior, it stopped irritating me. So that's my story. Maybe you thought it'd have more pizzazz. But if you're disappointed, imagine me writing the grant report to Lily. Having spent $20,000 of your dollars, we are still buzzing about each other's throats like hornets in heat. But I am happy to report that one of my colleagues irritates me less. Still, that semester it continued to work on me. Like water dripping on a rock, like a glacier on a mountain. And what I want to tell you about is 3 practices that I took away from this extended conversation. 3 things I've learned about how to live conversatio morum, that I think each of us is called to make that vow by virtue of our baptism. And these are the 3 practices. And I want to talk about each just a little bit. Seek truth, speak truthfully, and be true. The first one, seek truth. Now that seems like that would be obvious enough if you're open to conversion. It's more contentious than it sounds, just beginning with the very definition of what is truth. It's one of those things, Augustine at one point in time said, when you ask me about time, I know exactly what time is, except when I have to give you a definition. Think about that for a moment. How do you define time? It's the passing of, right? How do you define truth? When no one's asking me, I know exactly what it is, but someone asks me what truth is, it's much more difficult to respond. The classical definition of truth, which was aptly articulated by Thomas Aquinas and still kind of finds its home in Webster's dictionary up to this day, defines truth as being in accordance with the actual state of affairs, the body of real things and events and facts. In Thomas's words, veritatis est adequatio rei et intellectus. The quest for truth is the quest to know what is real at its most essential level. And that quest implies an engagement, not a withdrawal from, but an engagement of the world, coming to know through one's senses what actually exists. It implies experiencing life in all of its little nooks and crannies. What exists out there to be known? What do I see? What do I hear? What can I learn? The quest for truth doesn't restrict any line of inquiry, even though it might look kind of frivolous or ill-conceived. As one of my friends said to me last week in Alaska, looking out over that landscape, I want you to take note. There are no straight lines in nature. If the pursuer is genuine in their love of truth and willing to keep pursuing and keep asking questions and keep letting go when discovering something more is true, then all roads eventually lead to the same place. All stars eventually to one manger. And if there's no king in that crib, real magi are going to eventually figure that out. We don't need to worry. What is inevitable, and what we will have to spend some time figuring out, is that quest for truth is going to surface some hard questions, such as, what's really real? What do I do with bits that I discover that do not fit into what I already know? What do I do about the fact that two of us who are both in the same church and profess the same faith and hold it deep in our hearts come to different conclusions about what is real? Is there more than what I'm seeing? The Oxford Dominican Herbert McCabe captures this aspect of the quest when he says, in the end, you have to love what is real more than what is true. Now, I don't think he means to pit those two against each other, because eventually they're synonymous. I think he's simply emphasizing that if you love truth, if that is your motto and conversion to truth is your life's work, you have to always be open to finding out something that would make you let go of what you think right now, even though that letting go would be really painful indeed. And that means that in the pursuit of truth, if one is really serious about it, it's always a paschal journey. When it comes right down to it, you're going to find out things that you wish you did not know. And sometimes the pieces aren't all going to fit, and sometimes they don't all make sense, and sometimes they'll seem contradictory. And if you really value truth above all else, you will need to learn how to live in a place of radical incoherence for periods of time, sometimes long periods of time. And still to live conversatio morum, you must still desire to know what's really real. The Catholic intuition holds that beyond the last digit of pi, beyond the farthest star at the edge of the universe, beyond the tiniest atom, beyond the morass and all the pieces of the puzzle that we cannot understand, beyond what the senses are able to grasp, there is something more. There is an ultimate reality that does not contradict what we've perceived by the senses, but's nevertheless far beyond them. And this something is not a thing at all, but a who. Not an object, but a subject. In the words of the Italian moral theologian Dalmasio Mangillo, Christianity has become very messed up. People think it's about knowing and following rules and regulations. No, Christianity is about the enjoyment of a person. Ultimately, it's not head knowledge that we acquire in our quest for truth. It's relational knowledge. And this is going to have some implications. Speak truthfully. Now, it seems only natural that if we're going to speak about a vow of conversation, we will need to say something about speaking. And it seems only natural that if conversion is about being open to truth, the conversations we are going to have are going to need to be spoken truthfully. Often the first thing that comes to people's minds when I say speaking truthfully is we think it means speaking honestly, not hiding things from each other or holding them back. And those are really important characteristics of speaking truthfully, and they should not be ignored. But that's not the whole of it. Perhaps at no other time in the church's history is it as clear as it is right now that there has got to be a profound consonance between what we want to communicate and how we communicate it. For example, we know that there's something that's not quite right when I, as a high school teacher, would get quiet in my classroom by yelling, "Be quiet!" There's something not quite right when the communion song makes people want to hold their ears. So ultimately, if truth is not an object but a subject, speaking truthfully means speaking in ways that are consonant with the truth that we have encountered as a person. St. John says God is love. And we have to think about what that implies. Love, by its very nature, is not coercive. It can't be forced. It always allows the other to freely respond. No one wants to be loved by someone who is being paid to do so. Hence, speaking truthfully implies absence of coercion or pressure. It leaves people space to explain themselves, change their minds if they want to. It should open us to changing our minds if we're persuaded to do so. And it even implies vulnerability, being open to the fact that the other might not respond in the way that we hoped, and that we don't get to control their response. My own experience of teaching in the ministerial community these last 15 years has led me to keep the Bible and the book Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most, right next to each other on my bookcase. One tells me what I believe, and the other one gives me a way of communicating it that is consonant with what I believe. And I don't think we've thought about that enough yet in the church. My third final point, be true. This is the last thing I want to mention. Perhaps it's a little less obvious than the other two, but let me tell you a secret. I suspect it's actually the most important of them all. If it's true, as Mangiolo asserts, that Christianity at its very core is about the enjoyment of a person, then it makes sense that enjoyment, especially enjoyment of persons, aka friendship, is at the heart of the life of ongoing conversion. We learn lots of things from taking workshops and being at conferences and from reading and from observing the world around us. These things can change our way of looking at things. But there is a particular kind of education that happens in the context of friendship that creates a safe space for immense transformation to happen. Friendship is the place where we learn the truth about ourselves and others and what it means to be in relationship. In the free sharing of what happens at a table, new insights are born and fallacies are gently pointed out and let go. We can name our deepest fears without fear, and we can make mistakes and still be loved. We can be daring and free in trying out new behaviors and ideas. And as such, Aristotle says that friendship is the school of virtue. Because we're accepted exactly as we are, we can ironically become different persons. Ongoing conversion requires fidelity to relationships with people even after they have long stopped being interesting. Even after their jokes are stale and you know all of their stories and you can guess the next thing that's about to come out of their mouth. And all of their issues are spectacularly clear to everyone except them. And you know that they're saying the same thing about you. In essence, conversatio morum requires the capacity to be true. Now, I'm not saying that all friendships, all relationships need to be that way. That would be pretty much impossible to maintain. But I am saying that at least some of your relationships need to be that way. If you're going to be serious about lifelong growing and changing, you've got to have, as St. Benedict figured out so long ago, some real stability. So this is love, we say. thought it'd have more pizzazz. But these people, these relationships, this is my life. Here, nowhere else is my life. Which is the reason why this past weekend, in the middle of writing this talk, in the frenzied middle of a summer schedule that is so jammed, I'm sure much like yours, that I'm embarrassed to talk about it in public, I skipped town. I went out to a cabin out in the woods with, yes, the same people I told you about earlier. Long after our initial grant funding had ceased, a group of us continues to practice the vow of conversation with each other. We don't work with each other anymore. And some of us now live at quite a distance and have to fly in. But we still have the commitment to go away with each other 2 weekends a year and continue to speak truthfully, seek truth, and be true to each other. What we do is we bring incidences from our current work, our current lives, to get honest, occasionally brutally honest, but loving feedback from each other about where we might need to continue to grow and to change, to become those people that we sense that our baptism has called us to be. And we still continue to talk until the pizza burns. Once upon a time, when I was a student chaplain, doing my CPE in a senior living facility, I was sent to visit a woman who was well into her 80s and who had the practice of swimming every day. In that sort of polite chit-chat that's intended just to get a conversation going, I mentioned that I love water and that as I got older, I could see myself swimming every day also. She stopped me short. "Do you swim now every day?" she asked. "No." "Then you won't when you're old either." If you love the waters of your baptism, don't just walk around the edges of that pool, wondering when will finally be the right time for me to throw myself anew into the deep. Swim in that pool every day. Dog paddle, float, do laps, tread. Those are not just waters that you have passed through. Those waters are your life. Those are the waters in which you are called to live. And daily practice becoming the person, being the person that you want to become. Conversatio morum. This is your life. Here, nowhere else.